Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. I thought I'd kick off this new year of utterly pointless comparisons with a four-way affair.
上菜
Oh, it is, Xena. It is. I'll be looking at the arcade, NES, Commodore 64, and Atari 2600 versions of Irem's Kung Fu Master. Here's a look at the specs of all the hardware involved, while I tell you just a smidge about the game. Irem released Spartan X into Japanese arcades in 1984. Later that same year, it was brought to the US by Data East with the new moniker Kung Fu Master. Now the story of the original Spartan X is a mishmash of two martial arts movies of the era, Jackie Chan's Spartan X, which you may know better as Wheels on Meals, and Bruce Lee's Game of Death. Weird, huh? For the game itself, it's one of the earliest, if not the earliest, side-scrolling brawlers. It has very large characters and a decent repertoire of moves. The game only has 5 levels though, and you can complete it in about 5 minutes when you know what you're doing. But it'll take you some time to develop that kind of skill. Kung Fu Master found its way onto many platforms in the mid to late 80s, 3 of which we'll be looking at today. There's the Commodore 64 version, which was developed by Berkeley Softworks and was released in 1985. Personally, that's the version that I played the most when it was new. Next up, also in 1985, we have a Famicom version that was developed by Irem and published by Nintendo in Japan, where it was called Spartan X, like the arcade game. The following year, Nintendo would release the game in the US with the new name Kung Fu. Last, and certainly least, is the Atari 2600 port that was released by Activision in 1987. That was way past the prime of the Atari 2600. Now I'll be showing you the complete game on each of these platforms that I mentioned, which I can do since, like I said, the game's only about 5 minutes long. Now on the NES, you get a slightly different ending if you complete the game twice in a row. All it does is change the layout of hearts that surround your characters during the ending. And there is absolutely zero truth to the rumor that if you play that version of the game 50 times, you'll get to, for some reason, fight your captured girlfriend Sylvia at the end of the game. This was a BS rumor that came from a Japanese manga that was called Famicom Rocky. It was denied by the developers of the game later, and it was also proven wrong many times over on YouTube. For recording methodology, I did use save states in each of the versions to help keep the gameplay in sync as closely as possible. As far as the video format goes, I'll show you the arcade and NES version together first, then we'll move on to the C64 version, and we'll finally wrap things up with the Atari 2600 port. Alright then, let's get on with it. And so it begins. Right off the bat, we can see the characters are much larger in the arcade game. They also have more animation frames. We can also see the background and other visual elements are more detailed in the arcade. The NES port just has a simple blue background without any columns, beams, or windows. Strangely enough, they decided that the main hero Thomas needed to wear a black t-shirt under his gi on NES for some reason. Maybe the Den of Evil was just a bit chillier inside Nintendo's little gray box. We're already approaching our first boss, and he's pretty easy in both versions. If you have enough health, you can just rush in and kick him to death, or you can jump kick him a couple of times. Level 2. Yeah, pretty similar aside from the size and detail differences we already discussed. Another thing I'll mention here is that personally, I find the control much more responsive in the NES port of the game. It's much easier to do jump kicks in that version, for example. You can hear that the music is pretty close on NES, and they even managed to stick in a few PCM voice samples for sound effects. And here's our boomerang-throwing pushover of a level boss. And he's gone. The cutscenes on NES feature a little bit of background, and the text is different from the arcade game. Wait till you hear what the laugh in the arcade version sounds like, which you will in a few levels. We're back to scrolling to the left for level 3. This level is pretty simple, basically just a swarm of all the human baddies we've seen up to this point. The grabbers, the knife throwers, and the little guys who are also known as tom-toms. The little guys do sometimes jump on your head when you duck in both versions of the game. I'll note here that all the kanji you see on the columns in the arcade game in each level are actually the Japanese characters for their numbers 1 through 6. Ichi, Ni, San, Shi or Yon, Go, and Roku. They help you gauge your progress on each floor. On NES, these kanji characters are near the top of the screen since there are no columns. And the boss. He's big in the arcade. He's little on NES. He's easy to take out in both. Level 4, we're headed back to the right, dealing with these flying things. They're moths in the arcade game for sure, but I don't know what exactly they look like on NES. Their movements are a bit more erratic in the arcade original, and they're tougher to hit in that version too, since they approach you from angles in between where your blows land. Once we're through with them, we just have a little section while we approach the most annoying boss in the entire game. Yeah, make sure not to jump kick this one or hit him in the head. Kneel and just punch him until he's gone. Now listen to the deep laugh in the arcade game, while you watch Thomas make a sexually suggestive comment. Please, Thomas, you've got a job to do first. This is it, the final level. Will we save Sylvia? Well, I won't spoil anything except to say that yes we will. This level is basically a repeat of level 3 with a higher quantity of bad guys. They're still all the same ones though. And we will, of course, have a different boss at the end. So, theory time, and feel free to shoot me down if I'm wrong, NES fanatics. I opened a real-time sprite viewer for this in the emulator on NES, and I didn't see Thomas in the sprite table. He seemed to be in the background tiles with part of the floor always in frame with his feet. Now this explains the vastly reduced background detail on NES. Notice that he's always in the center of the screen except for when a level starts or ends. All this will also explain the lack of flicker with so many quote-unquote sprites on the same line in this version. Anyway, here's Mr. X. He blocks some of your moves, but you can still easily dispatch him with a couple of jump kicks to the face in both versions. Gee, this ending music in the NES game sounds a tad familiar. Isn't that swell? They'll live happily ever after. Or make that happily for a short while. Who knows, maybe they broke up right after this. And that's the NES version of Kung Fu in the books. Next up, I'll tackle the C64 port. Here's the Commodore 64 port of Kung Fu Master, which I played an awful lot of as a kid. And honestly, it ain't half bad. The characters are larger than the NES version, but as you can see, they're a lot blockier since they're lower resolution. The C64 game has a lot more detail on the floor and has the beams, windows, and columns in the background, unlike the NES game. But it is missing the progress kanji and the detail from the bottom of the screen. Control in the C64 port is a little goofy. The lone fire button attacks, up jumps, and spacebar toggles between punches and kicks, which you need to do a few times in order to beat the game. Like with the NES version we just saw, they reduced the walk cycle to 2 animation frames. Oh, and jump kicks are basically useless on C64 with one exception at the very end of the game. Alright, level 2. On C64, here's a fun little oddity. They reverse the angle of the ceiling and floor tiles when you're on levels that scroll from left to right. Weird. Anyway, we've got all the enemies and crap falling from the ceiling that you'd expect here. For some reason, the little guys, or tom-toms, they look like they're wearing fishnet bell-bottoms on C64. Kinky. Also, those screen glitches happen on real C64 hardware. They seem to most often pop up when you turn around. Here's our pushover boomerang boss. Hey look, the stairs on these levels that scroll to the right retain more of the 3D look from the odd-numbered levels on C64, unlike the arcade game. The arcade game uses a fixed perspective, so the angle would be away from us. Sorry, C64 fans, no cutscenes for you. Level 3. Not much to talk about here. The games remain similar content-wise. One sort of trick thing in most versions of Kung Fu Master is to just keep walking until you absolutely have to stop to throw a punch or kick. The more you progress towards the end of the level, the fewer enemies you'll have to fight. And on C64, you can even jump over the tom-toms. Alright, here's the hilarious boss on the C64 version. They were able to make this boss huge on C64 due to some hardware techniques that result in large, even blockier sprites. But you can take comfort in the fact that he's still a pushover in both versions of the game. In level 4, we can see the C64 background tiles are reversed again, just like in level 2. The moths from the arcade game look like bees on the C64. Also, their little square bee holes vanish right after they emerge. Also, like the NES port, the C64 game is missing the trapdoor at the beginning of all of the levels from 2 through 5. Like in both other versions we've looked at so far, to beat the wizard on the Commodore 64 version, you have to duck and punch him to death. The C64 has by far the easiest version of this boss fight. Once again, no cutscene on Commodore 64. How sad. Or, not. And here's the final level on the Commodore 64. You get attacked by way more enemies in the arcade version of this level than the C64 port. Rarely, however, on C64, you can have up to 5 enemies on screen here, but most of the level is a pretty clear walk from right to left. Now we've reached Mr. X on C64. This game has by far the worst version of the Mr. X fight. You have to hit him with specific moves to take him out. A standard kick, a low kick, standard punch, low punch, jump kick, and then a punch. If you don't do each of these specific things, he'll just block everything until the timer runs out. Yeah, there's no ending on the C64 version, and I won't make you sit through the arcade one again, so on with the show. That'll do it for the Commodore 64 version. Aside from a little bit of dodgy collision detection and an infuriating final boss, it was a really great game for the time it came out. How will the Atari 2600 version fare on its meager hardware? Let's find out. You might expect the Atari 2600 version of Kung Fu Master to be god-awful. Instead, it's only a little awful. Still kind of impressive for the hardware. I just love that everyone looks like they're wearing the scarf Daredevil wore over the top of his head in the earlier episodes of the Netflix series. Anyway, enemy movement in the Atari 2600 version is super annoying. They go way faster or slower depending on whether you stand still, walk left, or walk right. And when you kill enemies, they just immediately vanish on the old 2600. Here's the first boss fight. On the 2600, he's missing his stick. Not good for a guy named Stick Fighter. Makes you wonder why they call him that in this version. Also, there are no staircases at the end of the levels in the 2600 port. Hey, the little 2600 even has all the enemies in this section. Nice work, programmers. While the 2600 version also has only one button like on the C64, I think they use it a little better here. You just press the button by itself for a kick, or down on the button for a low kick, or down forward on the button for a low punch. And that low punch is super handy for dispatching the little tom-toms in this version. As you can see, the levels in this Atari version are a bit shorter than the other versions. Oh, look at that, we get the boomerang boss. That's kind of a surprise. Yeah, no cutscenes for you in the Atari 2600 port. An oddity in the 2600 version is that it plays the same game start jingle at the start of every floor. Yeah, that doesn't get annoying. Not at all. Also, I personally find it hilarious that when Thomas is walking in the Atari game, his feet are black, but if he's jumping, kicking, or kneeling, his feet turn white. Alright, here's our giant boss. And on the 2600, he's not so giant. In fact, he's pretty much just the first boss all over again. Oh, 2600. Things had been going so well. In level 4, the poisonous moths just sort of teleport in on the 2600 instead of coming from panels in the wall. I don't have a whole lot more to say on this level, so I'll shut up for now. And here's the boss. On the 2600, he's just like the boss from levels 1 and 3, only now he fires lightning bolts at you. They'll kill you really quickly if you don't avoid them. Like the other versions, you have to punch him in the gut to kill him. Oh, look at that! It's the last time that I'll ever tell you that the Atari 2600 version of Kung Fu Master doesn't have cutscenes. And here we are, the final level in the final version of the comparison. We've got our standard baddie-filled level in both versions. It takes longer to get through it in the original arcade game, of course. And here's Mr. X. On the Atari 2600, he looks the same as every other boss pretty much, except for maybe the one on level 2, since at least that one was holding a boomerang. Anyway, just bash him till he dies and you'll be done with this. Like with the Commodore 64 port, there's no ending here, so, well, we're done. And that's about it for this special 4-way comparison. The NES and C64 versions are both really good for their respective systems. The Atari 2600 version is kind of okay at best because of the weird enemy movement. If I'd included the Atari 7800 version, well, it's similar to the 2600 version with much better graphics, but the enemy movement problem is way worse in that one. And that particular version of the game is a very good candidate for another episode of Complete Trash. So of the 4 versions we looked at today, which one is the best? Well, visually, it's easily the arcade game. Sound is actually pretty good in all of them. Gameplay-wise, I'd give a slight edge to the NES version. So in the end, I'd say the arcade game overall is the best, and for the home ports we looked at today, the NES version is clearly the best of the bunch. Anyway, what did you guys think? What's your favorite home port of Kung Fu Master? Was it one of the ones I didn't show you today? Did you play this game much back in the day? Tell me all about your experience with Kung Fu Master in the comments. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please toss it a like and share it. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you'll never miss another of my videos. If you can and you want to help support the channel, you could now do that at either Patreon or Ko-fi. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.